next thing is we want to actually set up the login activity. Okay, so I'm going to start that off just like I would for any new activity. I'm going to go up to the app. You can see under res, you can see under my code. Right now I have 2 activities in this project. If you're looking at your game library, you should already have 3. Okay. I want to go to here, say new, right click and say new. I'm going to say new activity, empty activity. I'm going to call this my login activity. Okay, remember that any activity we create needs to end with the word activity. So login activity, the layout's going to be activity underscore login. I'm going to hit finish on that dialog. Okay. It's going to ask if I want to add these 2 new files to version control, and I'm going to say yes. Okay, so I've got a new class and I've got a new layout. Really quickly, I'm going to set up the layout for what we're doing right now. I'm going to keep it super simple. You can get fancy with this. It's going to look a little bit weird. All I'm going to do is add a button. Okay. The reason is I just need some way to initiate the code that we're going to write, and then Google's going to provide the rest of the UI. So I just need to add a button to the UI. That's it. Okay. So this is going to be my login button. And give that as my ID. Factor, and I'm just going to center it in the screen. Cool. Super simple layout. Right? I've got a login button that's centered in the screen. Let me switch over to the split view, and I'm going to change the text of this button to login. Just going to say login, and then I'm just going to extract that string. So extract string resource, login, button, done. All right, that's all I'm doing for the layout today. Is really super simple. You can get more fancy with it. So for instance, it's pretty common to maybe have a logo for your app, and you might show that logo here. But it's worth mentioning that the intent of this screen is the user's generally not going to see the screen for very long. The screen should be very transitory. So it won't actually have, say, the username field or the email field or the password field. Most of the controls are basically going to be on the next screen. So oftentimes I might even forward the user automatically onto that next screen. This is just to make sure that, hey, if they get stuck here, they have a way to go forward. Cool? Okay. So that's that entire layout. Now if I run the app, I've added this login activity, but notice where the user still starts. Right? The user is still starting on main activity, right? Because typically when you add another activity, that's it's a child activity, it's somewhere later in the screen, right? And so, in terms of navigation so far, we've done a few things, right? Our navigation, we're going to graph all of the activities that you can go to. You've got main, you've got movie details, or in your case, it might be game details. And say from game details, you can go to compose review. So far, so good, right? So this is the navigation pattern that we have so far: is main to game details to compose review, right? And where I want to put this in is I want to put in login is here, right? You start at login and you go to main. Make sense? Okay. That's where we want to change this to be. Now, what we've seen so far is I can use an intent to go from one activity to another, right? So with the things we've done so far, I could work it this way. I could say, hey, the user starts at main, goes to login, and comes back. And you can do that with Firebase, right? If you wanted the user to be able to use the system without being logged in, that's how we would rig it. Does that make sense? If the user is going to start with, oh, I can browse your library, I can browse the list without being to log in, and then at some point when I say, hey, I want to add it to the movie, then you may tell them to log in. It might look like this. Cool? But what I'm trying to create is that other pathway is that we start at login and go to main, right? For simplicity's sake. That's the real reason I'm doing it this way. It also gives me a chance to illustrate a few things that I couldn't illustrate the other way. Okay? So I want you to build it with this workflow in mind. Now, let's look at the manifest right now as it stands. So remember, every time I add an activity, it's going to add another record to the manifest, right? So right now, if I look in here, I've got 3 activities. I got login activity, I've got main activity, and I've got movie details activity. Everybody see that? I've got 3 activities. And you probably also have a compose review in there somewhere. Remember, I usually want to arrange those based on the order that the user is going to flow through them. It just makes it easier to read that way, but it really doesn't matter what order they're here. Okay, so if I look at main activity, what makes main activity special is the contents that are currently inside of it. Let me get rid of that extra blank line here. So in terms of the main activity tag, it's got this intent filter, okay? That intent filter says, oh, if you have this kind of implicit intent, then I want to capture that. Remember, if I've got explicit intents, I'm saying specifically go here. If I've got an implicit intent, I'm saying, well, this kind of thing. So namely, there's an action and a category, okay? So there's an action of main and a category of launcher. That kind of intent is to tell the app that, hey, I want to start basically the first screen of the app or the main activity is to kind of know, okay? Now, the difference here is I don't want this to be main anymore. I don't want this to be the thing that you start with from the launcher. I want it to be login. So bear with me on there? Okay. So what I need to do is I need to move that intent filter over. You might notice right now this activity is empty, so I need to take that out, add a closing tag, so now it's not immediately ending, and I need to take the intent filter out of main activity and move it up here. So that intent filter, main launcher, is really what defines what is the first activity that the user sees. That part of the manifest is what tells the user, I'm going to start here. Okay? It's worth mentioning that you typically, you are allowed in here to have multiple mains. And if you have more than one that's defined as the main launcher, those activities will all appear as apps that the user has installed. But typically, we're only going to select one. We're going to select one screen as being the main. Cool? That's where the user is going to start. It is complaining a little bit because whatever's main has to be exported. Exported means basically that you can get that it's exposed, that you can get to there directly. And it turns out actually we should probably have a few of these exposed. So login activity should be exported. Main activity should be exported. Also, my details activity should also definitely be exported because I may want to have things like notifications link directly into the detail screen. And so I can't do that if those aren't exported. Cool? Everybody good with that? So we got 3 exported activities. If I start the application now with that change in place, it should start us on the login screen, right? So we start at the login screen instead of starting at main activity. Great. That's really all we have to do. If we decide to change the different which screen appears first, all we've got to do is move that part, that intent filter, to that screen. Cool. Now, things we might notice immediately is if I click the login button, nothing happens, right? So I might want to jerry-rig a quick patch in there to make sure that I can get in, right? So I might want to go to the login activity code and rig up that button to respond to the on-click listener. So I might say private button, login button. Boop. Set this up as I've done before. And so login button is equal to find view by ID, r.id, login button. So remember, I find the views, any views that I need, which in this case we just have a single button, and then I need to register listeners. So here we're just going to say, hey, when they click on the login button, let's say set on click listener. Set on click listener. Take the view that you clicked on. And the easiest thing to do would be to just send them to main activity, right? Easiest thing to do would be just say, hey, we're just going to send you directly there. So I need to make it an intent. So intent, beep, intent is equal to a new intent. We're going to make it explicit intent, so I'm going to say pass the context and pass the activity where we want to go to. Now, at least for the moment, I don't have any additional data I need to pass. All I need to do is tell it to go over to that screen. Yep. Okay. So we need to create an intent that says go over to main activity. And I'm going to say start activity and use that intent. So no data being passed. We're just going immediately on. We're just going to go on to the next screen when the user clicks that button. Okay. So now I can click that. I can get over here, and I could hit back, and that would navigate me back to this previous screen. Okay. So now I have a way I can go. I can kind of start that flow, log in, and work back. Okay. So if you are running into an issue where your authentication is not working, you might try to do that at least as a temporary fix. Cool. As a way to just skip on to the next thing. Because this next part that we're going to do, I have had some issues with it. Okay, I have had some issues with it, but that's one way to bypass it. And obviously the user isn't providing login credentials that way, so it is something we'll need to correct, but it is a workaround at least. Okay. What's the next part of this that I'm going to do? So I set up that login. Oh, let's talk about real quickly when I log in. Remember that we usually want to do up navigation and have up navigation behave the same way as back navigation. You might notice right now that there is no up arrow. Can everybody see that? Right now there's no up arrow. And my back button works, but there's no up arrow for the user. That's actually okay, because that's where we're going to end up wanting it to be. We're going to end up wanting it as providing the user can't go back. The only way that they can sign out is by using our sign out link. Cool? So that the fact that there's no arrow there, usually we want to fix that. This is a case where we don't want that arrow to be there. Okay. Now, let's look at the code. So what do we need to do for logging in? There's some example code that you can find in the docs. I've kind of borrowed that here and altered it a little bit. So there's a few things we need to do to start and initiate the login process. Okay. The first thing we need in order to start the process is we need to come up with this activity result launcher object. Okay. That is what we're going to use to first of all launch the second activity, and also to get feedback when that activity is done. So bear with me there. So I'm going to use that both to start the activity and to get the response when it completes. Okay. There's a bit of code here, so let's look a little bit at what's going on. We say register for activity result. Okay. Register for activity result is actually part of the Android framework itself. It's not part of Firebase. It's a relatively new feature. So there historically has been a way to do this very same thing, but this is a kind of a new way to do the same idea. The idea is I want to start another intent, another activity with an intent, and then later get basically an intent back. Okay. So it's a little bit different than how we used to do this, but that's part of Android. It takes two things. It takes a contract, and as well it takes a callback. So there's two arguments to that constructor. I won't get into the contract, partly just because I haven't had a chance to review that documentation myself, because this is very, very new. First time I've seen it. So there's some sort of contract that they're passing, and there's also the callback here. So we're saying here's that second argument is a function. It takes a result, and then here it's going to call a function called onSignInResult. That function on the right-hand side of that arrow is one that we need to write. Okay, so when we put this code in, that's going to be in red because that function doesn't exist yet. Okay, because it's a function we have to write here in a minute. So I'm going to bring that in verbatim as the first thing in here. So back to my project. I should have brought in the comment while I was here. Boop. Okay. So I need that first part. There's a few different dependencies that are missing. So I need to import the result launcher and import the contract. So I'm going to add those two things. OnSignInResult is still red because we don't have that yet. Okay. Another thing that they did, and to kind of from their code example, they did actually save this to an instance variable, so we may want to do that as well. So I'm going to add another instance variable up to the top. So these are my views. This is my state. That be private. So private activity result launcher, sign in launcher. Okay. So I've got that, and that way this is an instance variable instead of a local variable. I don't know that that matters much. I think that it looks like it can be either way, but that was how they had in their example. Okay. So first things first, we have to create the sign in launcher. One thing to notice here is I'm creating it on create. I'm not creating it at the time the user clicks the button because I do want to reuse this object and not create a new one every time the user clicks the login button. Cool? So it's intentionally not in the on-click listener. Okay. Next up is back to here. There's a few things we need to do inside of the on-click listener itself. So I'm going to bring those things in. Comment out what I have. Boop, boop. And talk about what we need. Okay. So bring that in. Auth API, Auth UI, array list, list. So in order to kick off the Firebase UI, which is what we're doing here, provides a few different different functionality in terms of workflows and such. First thing we have to do is tell it what providers, what login providers or sign-in providers to use. So if I bring it this way, I'm saying, okay, we'll make a list of these IDP configs. You'll see that there's an email provider and there's a Google provider, right? This list depends on what providers you want to use. And remember, we set that provider up, those providers up in the console. So if we select a provider here that we haven't selected in the console, obviously things are not going to work, right? So remember, at the moment at least, the only provider I've set up on the console is the email provider, email password. Okay. So because I have that, I'm just going to comment out the second one, which is the Google provider, right? So for the moment, I'm just going to say, hey, email provider is the only one I have. Okay. Next up, we need to create the actual intent to start the sign-in flow. Okay, so here we're saying auth UI get instance, so we get instance of the auth UI object. We're going to say, let's create this sign-in intent builder, set the available providers. That's where we're providing that list of providers. And then finally, we say build. I wish that acronym, I wish that series of steps was a lot shorter. But that's the API that they've provided to us. In here, maybe in terms of both this area as well as that area, you might see the word builder. Okay, so this says builder here for the providers. This also says builders for the intent. Anybody know what a builder is? What is a builder? Build something, right? So a builder is what we call a design pattern. It's a design pattern. There's a lot of different design patterns that exist in terms of like standard ways of building code and solving problems. Specifically, a builder, just so you know, its job is to construct a class. It's an object whose job is to construct another object. Okay, so you make this builder first, you set all the parameters, and then you finally call build on it, and it produces the thing you want. Okay, that's really all it is. It's basically the end goal is you make this thing, and then it goes away when you ask for build, right? The other way that we could have done this, oftentimes, at least in theory, is I could have just said new intent, right? Or I could have said new provider. Some cases that process of just saying, hey, let's construct a new thing isn't really practical. In some cases, it isn't possible. So in a lot of cases, that constructor for the thing you actually want might be private, okay? Or it might be protected. It might not allow you to construct that. If you see that, more than likely there is a builder that you need to actually use instead, okay? So part of what it's actually doing is preventing the user's direct access to the constructor. The other reason that this often exists is because constructing the object is usually hard, okay? If there's a builder there, there's usually a reason. Part of it is usually that constructing the object directly is usually difficult, or there's a bunch of code that needs to happen in order for that thing to get constructed, such as you may need to read some files. So in this case, it's already talking to the Google.service.json we added. So it has to do some sort of file I/O to get that configuration, right? So there may be some processes and more time-consuming things that go on there. So the idea is to kind of abstract us from those setup. The other thing is, because we're using setters now to set these things up, it means that it's a lot easier to support a bunch of optional parameters rather than having the user, here's a giant constructor with 20 parameters, let me give that to you, and you have to figure out those 20 parameters as a brand new developer. I don't want to do that. So that's one of the reasons this exists, is make it different. The other reason why this builder pattern exists is because it works really well for chaining. Typically speaking, if we're using just a regular constructor, chaining is not all that practical. It's not all that easy. But if we have this builder pattern, then chaining is really, really simple. So you kind of see things that are happening here. So we say new email builder. In between there, we could set additional parameters if we needed to configure the email provider. And then we call build at the end, right? There's actually only this whole thing right here is the constructor call. It's just that this class, email builder, is nested inside of two other classes. That's where those dots are. So IDP config is a class inside of UI, and email builder is a class inside of IDP config. So it's nested two levels down. So those aren't actually function calls or properties. They're just, it's a nested class. Here we kind of see that same thing. Say, hey, let's start by creating the builder. Let's set the available providers. I could set a bunch of additional things if I needed to change, for instance, how the workflow is going to look. So for instance, if I wanted to change some colors or some logos, that's where I would set them before I call build. But this works by every function from this point on. Once we get the builder, keeps returning builder, builder, builder. All those setters return builder, so you can keep chaining things onto it. So it's really popular today in the Android space because of those reasons. You'll see it all over the Android APIs where they're using builders because of that, because it supports chaining better, because it kind of hides some of the constructors, which for various reasons, Google's hidden a bunch of the constructors and made them private so that you don't have direct access to them, or made them package access. So that's kind of what's going on there. Okay. And then finally, we take that intent, and we're using the sign-in launcher that we created up here to launch that intent. Okay. You can kind of think about that as start activity. That's kind of what's going on here. Say start activity with that intent. The difference is that we're using the sign-in launcher because we want a response when that process finishes. Make sense? Okay. So let's implement the listener. So good news for the listener, I can go up to here on sign-in result, hit Alt Enter, and it's going to give me the option of creating a method on sign-in result in the login activity. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that option. And that has created my method, right? So now I have another method, right? So we have onCreate, which is doing the initial setup space. And we've got this additional function, which is what gets called after the user signs in. Make sense? So this callback will get called regardless of whether it succeeded or failed. If it failed or succeeded, this function will always be called. Okay. Now, without putting some code in there, we can go ahead and try it and see what it's doing so far. If I click login, and this is where I was struggling with this morning, is you can kind of see when I click login that the screen is flashing instead of it actually opening another screen. So some people, this is working on the emulator. More than half of you, it's not working. It's specifically not working for me. I'm not entirely sure what's going on from my end. I haven't been able to troubleshoot and solve it yet.
What's supposed to happen?
What's supposed to happen is what you saw on your physical device, right? You saw what you saw with the physical device, where it popped up a list of like providers, like popped up a list of your Google accounts. That was expected, okay? That was expected. So from my perspective, I might want to, if I'm in this route, I might want to immediately go and start debugging, okay? If I look at Logcat right now, let me go up and pull this out. I'm going to clear Logcat. I'm going to hit on the login button, okay? So if I look at what's in the login, You can see that logged 3 messages. This is without me putting any additional logging code in. It says this requires the Google Play Store, but it's missing, right? And it also says that again, and it says the service com.google.amper.gms internal auth API is not available. So effectively, it's telling me in order for this to work, I have to have at least some part of the Google Play Store or the Google services. You see that error? So then what that means to me is I think that this particular emulator that I'm using doesn't have kind of the full Play Store installed. Does that make sense? Right? And that's why it failed. It's failing. It's saying I need the entire. I need the Play Store. I need those Google services to be available in order to do the Firebase login. Okay, so that's actually where I'm not surprised that there is a difference between the emulators and the physical devices. Okay, all of your physical devices I know have a working Play Store. I know that for a fact. I know your physical device does have a working Play Store. The Play Store and those services working has been hit or miss on the emulators. And what I can even see with some people is it's working for some people and not others, which is kind of additionally weird, right? Things I could try to do to try and troubleshoot this, it might be just that I need to use a different emulator to make this work. But I would really recommend from you, the sure thing that you can do at this point is definitely use that physical device, right? So if you have your physical device, definitely pull it out and definitely plug it in, because that should at least work even if the emulator is not working. Okay. Okay. So a few things I can do just from the code perspective in here is I might want to check if it was successful or unsuccessful. Okay, I might want to say, hey, did this go through? Did you successfully sign in or did you unsuccessfully sign in? Just to get some additional logging in there. So if I say if, let me actually go back to my code sample. Here's the code that I put in there. And you can find this on the notes. I'm going to start with this. So the way that we know whether or not it was successful is based on the result code. And if I look at the result code, yeah, so it's okay if it was successful. It would be something else if it was unsuccessful. So basically, did the sign-in process, is the user now signed in, or did it fail to sign the user in? In the case where it failed, we can get more details about that by looking into, you can see looking into the response and calling get error. So I'm saying get IDP response. IDP, I believe, is short for like identity provider response. So if I hit login with that code in, you can see that maybe it's logging an error because it's failing to log in, right? In this case, it's logging it immediately because it's failing immediately. So basically, it's opening another activity, immediately going, hey, there's something wrong, and returning to my previous activity. Okay. In the case where this is working for you, right, I think yours, you're not going to see a log initially when you click the button, because it will be taking you to that other screen. This log will happen when you finish the login process. Is everybody good with that? So it will typically be when the user finishes that process. It usually won't be immediate. So that will at least give you a log. That will give you a way to handle the case where something fails. That's where we're going to get the exception. We can log that and take a look at it. If it does succeed, which means the user went through and successfully logged in, then we're going to get to that first pathway. Okay, and so you can see in there we can call Firebase auth. That's the overall Firebase API. Get instance to get an instance of that, and then call get current user. Okay, so Firebase auth.get instance.get current user will give us the currently logged in user, right? So if the user is logged in, that will return us an object. If they're not logged in, that will return no.
No, it's always
Okay. It's worth mentioning that don't use that as an indication as to whether or not it failed or succeeded, because the user might already be logged in. In which case it's still not going to be null even if it fails. So it's important that we're checking that way. Okay. So if I log in successfully, what you would see, you would say sign in successful user ID. I need to figure out if I can use a different emulator to fix this. But this is where I got stuck when I was prepping this morning. I got this far and it's like, why is my emulator not working? So my guess is I just need a different emulator. If y'all just want to come up here, maybe I can show you what it should look like. Okay, so now that we're back here, and in theory we have a user to work with, I can then initiate the next parts of the process. So, for instance, again, I could ask the user if they have, if they need to fill in additional things. So, for instance, I could make a query to the database and check for, do you have additional profile stuff at this point? But at this point, we're just trying to get them logged in. So the thing I'm going to do is grab the code that I had previously in the onClick listener, and rather than doing that in onClick, I'm going to do that in response to this event. So I do a quick log, and I'm going to start the main activity. Okay. And so then once you're signed in, you'll be over onto the list of activities. Okay. So that's the simplest and most basic version of signing in. Is you start this other process up when the user clicks the login button, you wait till it finishes, and then you send them over to the next activity. But you might notice this way, every time I start the app, it has to, right? It has to ask the user, like, hey, what's your username and password, right? Which isn't very convenient for testing, right? It's not very convenient from testing to have to do that every time, right? So one of the things I want to do is provide a way to automatically skip past that. Does that make sense to everybody? I want to automatically skip past this if the user's already logged in. Make sense? If the user's already logged in, we want to immediately just go on to the next thing. So things I can do, I can actually check, I can use this to get the current user at any given time. And I can use that to see if the user is already logged in. So some things I might want to do. I might want to say in here, get the current user. Maybe I'll call this, I'll just leave that as user. So get the current user. And if user does not equal null, then I might want to immediately send them over to main activity. Right? So if I do this, when that activity comes on screen, if the user's already logged in, they're just going to go straight on past to the next activity. Make sense?
It worked?
Yeah. So it's important, and it's important to do that in onClick. Okay. So that's a very, very quick tweak that'll make your testing a lot faster. Cool. Well, you don't have to see the screen every time. And in fact, if you watch it on your device, it's probably going to be so fast that you won't even see the first screen appear. Because long story short, we're in onCreate. onCreate actually is well before anything shows up on screen. There's actually some other lifecycle methods that get called before things appear. So they're never actually seen in the first screen. Okay. Other things I may want to do. I might want to go ahead and skip and say, well, maybe I don't want the user to press that login button, right? Maybe I want them to just go ahead and go on to the login process. Does that sound reasonable? Right? Sounds reasonable. Don't even have them click the login button. Let's immediately put them in the login code. If I want to do that, then that would be in the else case. Right? So if there isn't a current user, well, then we want to initiate and we want to have them go on to the next part. Okay. There's a few ways I could do that. One of the ways I could do is I could kind of extract some of the code that's in the onClick listener, move it around into another method, and have it go that way. Another way that I can put this in is I could just say login button dot perform click. What that will do is it will initiate a click on the login button. So the same code that would happen when you click the button will happen there. So that's another way to kind of speed this process through. Is you just say, okay, if the user's already logged in, we might as well just send them to main activity. And if they're not logged in, well then let's perform a click on the button. There is one gotcha here in that I'm kind of creating the intent for main activity in two places. You see that? So rather than duplicating that, especially because I may want to add more code later for the user to perform more registration kind of things, I want to make sure that that happens in both ways. I need to kind of put that into a function so I can reuse that code. So I might say here, private void, maybe I call this on login or on login success. And so I might say, let's take that and put it here. In fact, I might want to just make sure that there's a user and pass that in. So that way I can say on login success, give me the user, and here on login success as well. So now they're both of those pathways, whether it's because they're already logged in or because they just logged in, will both go over to on login success. Cool? Make sense?
So why are we passing user?
Just in case I need to do some additional logic, because it's
okay.
likely if, hey, if we need to do something about the user, I may need to know about that user, right? It's like, well, both of those pathways are already asked for the user. I might as well just pass that object down. Cool?
So did you define a user as a state variable?
I didn't, and I'm just keeping it as a local variable.
Oh, okay.
Cool? Make sense?
Well, can you explain what the
Yep.
perform click does once again?
So it initiates a click event on the button.
So it's just like normal clicking.
It's just like the user actually doing a tap.
Okay.
It's just that what's happening is I tell it to go ahead and do the click, so it happens when the screen comes on instead of the user having to click on the login button itself. So that means in the grand scheme of things, both of these ways, they're more than likely going to go to another activity, and they're not going to be here for very long in most cases. Does that make sense? So I want to put a little bit maybe on here to brand it, but I don't really care too much about what's on this activity. Yeah.
So we're in the on activity, or
Yeah.
on create rather, and
Yeah.
you've written Firebase user equals Firebase logs, get
Yeah.
instance, get current user.
Yeah.
How does it know which current user?
Yes. So basically, remember that there's a little bit of storage, right? There's a little bit of storage space on the device itself that's reserved for each app. Well, when the user logs in, it saves some information to storage. It actually persists that session. So when the user actually goes through the login process the first time, whether they're registering or they're logging in, it will save their user ID, their display name, their profile icon, all of that information, including like basically a token, to an actual file, right? So there's actually a file on the device that's remembering their session, and the next time the app starts, it reads that file.
Right
So
there
makes
in line
sense?
64.
Yeah. Basically on line 64, I'm telling it, okay, I want to get the current user, so we'll go read the file if it hasn't done it yet,
Then give it to Firebase.
and then give it back to us, right?
Oh, then give it back to us. Oh, so it doesn't even make a database call there.
No, there's no database call needed on line
okay.
64. On line 64, it just has to load from that local file to see if the user's already previously been logged in.
Oh, I see.
There's no database trip. So the only case where we need to get to the network is if the user's not logged in. If the user's already logged in, then we don't need to make a request on the network.